In our previous video, we presented an overview of the independent writing task, including discussing the general requirements for the task, the types of topics that you'll see on the test, and beginning to discuss how to plan a response to the topic. Now again, please note that the TOEFL Quick Prep download that we've been using throughout our videos does not include a sample independent writing task, so we'll be using a different topic for this video series. Now recall that the independent writing task, there only is one task on the TOEFL writing section, and you have 30 minutes to plan, write, and revise a personal essay of about 300 words. The essay itself must be typed, and a thing we did not mention in the first video is that the word processing feature on the test is pretty basic. It allows only for basic cutting and pasting. So this is very similar to the program that you might find on your PC called Notepad if you have a Windows-based computer. Once again, we mentioned in the first video that the writing section is evaluated holistically, which means instead of just looking at individual errors, they're looking at it as an overall evaluation or appraisal. In general, the test is looking for your ability to organize your thoughts, express your ideas clearly and logically, and use vocabulary appropriately. And I think, again, that's probably a little bit more important than demonstrating your grammatical accuracy. Once again, as we stated on the test, the level 5 response is the one that we're really looking for. So again, as we progress through this video series, you will see how we try to address certain aspects of the actual task, including thinking about that idea of organization. So that's kind of where we're starting here in this video, thinking about how we can have an essay that is well organized. Now again, notice the TOEFL does not specify, but we're going to make some guesses as to what we think the TOEFL is looking for when they're telling us that it needs to be well organized and well developed. So again, 0 to 5 is the scale. In my experience, content is generally more important than grammar. Organization of the essay seems to be more important than just the writing style. And fluency and expression are definitely highly valued because it does give the test raters enough information to evaluate. So, if you recall from our first video, our topic was focusing on the idea of team sports versus individual sports. Which one do we prefer? So, in our video this time, we're going to focus a little bit more on identifying which actual choice we're going to make. So this is something we're going to kind of start with in our video this time. Now this brings us really to our first trick. As we started looking at the different types of topics in the first video, we needed to notice that the language the TOEFL uses sometimes can be fairly deceptive. Now let's see what we mean when we mean deceptive. First off, there are 3 basic tricks that the TOEFL likes to use in the essay prompt. Language that is vague, extreme, and often confusing. So let's look at each one. First off, vague means basically open to interpretation or definition. So you would notice that the TOEFL frequently will use these kinds of words in their prompt. Some people, teachers, students. A factory is being built in your community. Now let's think for a moment, why are these particular words so vague, and why is this a potential issue? Well, again, first off, what do we mean by people? Do we mean our neighbors? Do we mean everybody in the world? When they say some people, obviously they're giving some kind of description, but the key here is that when they refer to people, who exactly are they talking about? Teachers and students. Again, many times they'll just say teachers on the test, but are they referring to university professors? Are they referring to public school teachers, elementary school teachers? Sometimes we even think of our parents as being teachers. Would they fit into this category? And of course, students. Are they talking about university students, high school students? In this particular topic, I borrowed this from a particular topic focusing on a factory being built. Well, you notice they just say a factory. They don't say what kind of factory. Certainly some companies might be more responsible than others, but if you'll notice, the idea of a general factory we kind of think of as something maybe causing pollution or causing a lot of traffic problems, but notice it doesn't specify what kind of factory. And then, of course, it also says in your community. Well, how do you define the word community? Do you mean right in your actual neighborhood? Or is it possibly 2 or 3 miles away from you? Or maybe even 10 or 15? Again, a lot of this will depend on how you interpret the question. Now, thinking about this, look at our current topic. Do we see any vague ideas in our topic today? Well, once again, we do see the word people, some people, while others. So the idea is the topic is kind of setting us up to think that there's one group and that there's another. Of course, the truth is there are people who might like both, but the topic doesn't necessarily specify. Also, what do we mean by team sports and individual sports? Are these only athletic in nature? There are other ways to compete that aren't necessarily sports-like, but they do involve competition. Would they be included in this situation? So you will notice that even in our topic, we have some things that we have to think about. How can we define them? Now, I think this is actually kind of an advantage if you think about it, because the truth is the TOEFL is not going to specify. They want to see how you interpret the question. So that comes in part of the idea of thinking about what we discussed in the first video. What are some advantages, disadvantages, pros and cons to both? And of course, thinking about, well, how do we define those? What would be logical? The TOEFL also likes to use kind of extreme words, such as always, or never, or most, or best, or sometimes even using words like only. Now, in our particular topic, do we have any extreme ideas? Well, I don't see words such as never, or always, or most, but again, I do see the idea that they're kind of making us think of only two particular groups. There's one group, some people, and then there's the other group. So if you think about it, this is kind of an extreme in itself. We've got this side and this side. But one question is it possible to actually like both? If it says which do I prefer, it seems to imply that I need to make one choice. Now, you will notice in a later video, I often encourage students to just make one choice. But clearly, it does not state that you have to choose only one. But it does give kind of the idea. We sort of infer from this that we need to make only one choice. But again, this seems kind of extreme in the sense that there are only two, one on one side and one on the other. Finally, many times the topics will include things that might be a little confusing for us. For example, often the comparison essay prompt has certain very specific qualifications that we're looking for. Oftentimes the comparison essay will ask us to compare two ideas and then finish by indicating which of the two we would prefer. But you will notice that in certain prompts we will see the word prefer used, and it looks like we're trying to balance between one choice and another. So the question, for example, is this considered a comparison essay? Well, let's take a look. Some movies are serious, designed to make the audience think. Other movies are designed primarily to amuse and entertain. Which type of movie do you prefer? So if you notice here, it asks us to show what we prefer, but it never actually states that we need to compare anything. So again, technically we would refer to this as a defense essay. We have to choose one of the two topics, one of the two choices given, and basically state which we prefer. But if you compare it to a comparison essay, again, remember a comparison essay will directly state that we have to compare or discuss the advantages or disadvantages of a point of view, and perhaps discuss the advantages and disadvantages of the other point of view. And then usually at the end of the comparison essay, we have to identify what we prefer and why. So notice in this particular one, I've highlighted the word compare here. Notice that it actually directly states compare. But later in the essay, it does say which do we prefer. So again, this can be kind of confusing to students. Oftentimes students may just think they have to make a preference, but instead they actually have to compare something. So look at this particular topic. Some people choose friends who are different from themselves. Others choose friends who are similar. Compare the advantages of having friends who are different from you to the advantages of having friends who are similar to you. Which do you prefer? So again, it looks like we're thinking about, okay, well this is a comparison essay, but it does ask me to make a choice. Well, again, the key, though, is that we do see the word compare. So this is clearly a comparison essay, not a defense essay, even though we do have to state our preference at the end. So throughout this video series, we're going to be looking at the actual process of writing itself. Now, in the first video, we started talking a lot about planning before we write, and let's review some of that very quickly. As we said in the first video, we really do need to understand thoroughly what the topic is asking us to do. So in a defense essay, we generally have to defend one point of view, and I recommend that you include at least 2 logical reasons for that particular point of view. As we just stated, comparison essays ask us to compare or discuss advantages, or generally advantages, but sometimes disadvantages, and then to give our preference at the end. And then finally, explanatory essays ask us to give an opinion by thinking again about 2 logical reasons. Now, the key is to recognize that once we identify the topic, we need to understand that each requires a certain basic set of requirements. We have to think deeply about the point of view, and we need to ask questions of ourselves. So again, part of the idea is thinking about, why do I believe this particular idea? If I'm going to make a choice, is it logical to think this way? What are some examples I can think of that help support these ideas? And we're going to look at that a little more carefully in this video. And of course, thinking an example too with examples, or thinking in connection to examples, how can I relate to this topic? So this really does bring us to the idea of how can we connect through our own personal experience. Now, this is something I mentioned in the speaking series as well. I really do think the TOEFL wants to see what your personal opinion is. So I really think we need to give a response that's going to be interesting. And I think responses are much more interesting if we include personal examples to help illustrate the ideas we're trying to get across. Now, in order to make a response more memorable, I often try to get students to think of at least one personal example that perfectly illustrates what you're trying to say. So again, for example, thinking about if the question is referring to the time when you were in school or your opinions about school, think about when you were a student. Or think about your family. Or oftentimes think about a particular event that may have happened to you. So in all 3 of my my little beginning here, introductions to sentences, they all reference something that's going to tell the audience that I'm going to say something personal here. Now, I really think that even though you may be a student coming from a different country, and you think that maybe your particular experience might be different from anyone else's, from everyone else's, the truth is that we do have kind of universal things that happen to us. So I do think that it's easier for the listener to identify if we have something personal to share. So again, I often tell students, don't just tell us something, show it to us. So if you say that something was difficult, well then show us how it was difficult. Show us some personal experience or situation that happened to you, or maybe to someone else. And also, I think it's important to recognize that even in the personal experiences that we have, many people can identify with them. So even if you're not from the same country, I think there is a lot of universality in the things that we share that are personal, the day-to-day things, the experiences that we have in life. So I think that's why it's important to indicate to use your personal experiences, because I think in a way it really does help the reader clearly identify with what you're trying to say. So it's time for us to try a little activity. Now, this is an activity you may or may not have done before, and actually it goes by many different names, but I'm going to refer to it here as concept mapping. So you might want to find a piece of paper and follow along as we go through this activity. So concept mapping is, again, another brainstorming tool to help us to begin thinking about a topic a little more deeply. It really does require you to make associations with word or ideas in any number of ways. And I think you can use this technique to prepare for really any of the essay topics, but even especially the explanatory and defense essays. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the concept map and to get us to think a little bit more about our personal experiences and to help produce some arguments that we can use in our essay writing. Now I'm going to use our topic, the topic that we're talking about here, the team sports and individual sports. Now I'm going to go ahead and reveal, and I'm going to actually say that I prefer team sports. So I'm going to start with that because I have more experience in team sports. Now, first off, as we stated before, this is a defense essay, so that's why I'm choosing one side instead of the other. But now in thinking about my team sports experience, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this concept map to help recall some experiences. So for example, in the middle of my concept map, I'm going to write the word team sports. And I'm going to draw a circle just like you see here. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to think, just for a moment, what are some of those previous team sport experiences I've had in my life? Well, for example, here I mentioned the fact when I played basketball in the 5th grade. Over on the right side, I'm drawing another circle and indicating when I played basketball in high school. On the left side, I'm thinking about, well, again, if we're defining team sports as maybe just competition, I also participated in what we call an academic team. So, again, maybe that might be an example I can use too. And then finally, I think about, well, one thing I also did when I was younger is play volleyball for fun. And of course, volleyball does require other people to play with. So if you notice, I have about 4 experiences here that I could kind of relate to immediately with this particular topic. So now in step 2, I'm going to look at my experiences. Now, again, on your piece of paper, I want you to do the same thing. Make a choice. Do you prefer individual sports or team sports? And then on your piece of paper, try to think about the individual experiences that you had. So I'm going to continue on with my example, but think about your example too as we proceed. So in this case, as I look at my choices, which one do I think may give me the most opportunity to discuss? Now, I'm actually going to use one of these examples just for this demonstration, but I'm actually going to use my basketball team experience in high school for my actual essay. So we'll actually come back to this topic a little bit later in the video series. But for this demonstration, I'm going to actually go kind of be creative here, maybe take a risk, and actually focus on the academic team experience. Now, you're going to see next how this concept map can continue to help me think a lot more about how this experience might relate to why I prefer team sports. So as we move along, what I'm going to think about next is what ideas can I connect to this experience? So again, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be adding more and more circles, and each circle is going to kind of branch out to a new idea. And I'm going to continue to try to connect those ideas because the idea here is I'm trying to follow my chain of thinking. So I'm going to start, again, I'm starting with the team sports here, and then I connect it to the academic team. But then notice how I will start connecting to other ideas that connect directly to academic team. So again, I'm thinking about the academic team now, and now I want to see how many different reasons can I think that might be helpful. Why did I think the academic team proves that team sports is better? Well, watch and follow along. So first off, I think a little more deeply. Why did I choose academic team? Why was that something that I wanted to do in school? Well, one thing, of course, was I felt like it was a great way to help improve my my overall academic skills. Oftentimes when we go home and do our homework, we're kind of by ourselves. Academic team, in a way, was a great way to relate to other people, especially people who might know more than me. So I know one of the reasons I chose academic team was to meet other people, but also to kind of learn from other people. Now, what did I learn from this experience itself? So as I'm thinking about this, I definitely think that the experience had some positives and some negatives. Obviously, this would be logical to think that we weren't always completely successful. But I did learn, for example, how to understand where my strengths and my weaknesses were. That's one of the values of being on a team, is that my weakness might be someone else's strength. And I keep thinking, how does this show I prefer team sports over individual sports? So again, I'm thinking about academic team. Why did I think about this example, and how does it show I prefer team sports over individual sports? Well, as I mentioned before, one thing I thought about was the fact that there are people on the team who knew more than I did, and I could learn from them. And then finally, I want to think about the actual specific details from this experience. Again, can I think about the actual team meets? Again, that's what you called competitions in academic team. What about the team practices? How did we improve, or how did we focus on learning information for these particular teams? Well, one thing I mentioned before was that I felt like academic team provided a balance of strengths and weaknesses. I had some strengths, but I definitely had some weaknesses. But there were other people who helped fill in my weaknesses with their strengths, and hopefully my strengths helped fill in for their weaknesses. So this is definitely one thing I can go ahead and start connecting to for the academic team experience. And again, on your piece of paper, think about how you can continue to connect by answering the questions we've discussed about our example. Now, from that experience of balance of team strength, I did think, for example, more specifically, one of my weaknesses was history at the time, but one of my strengths was math. So in this case, I felt like, well, I was good at math and others were better at history. So this was a particular detail I remembered from that experience. And in this way, because history was not exactly my strength, I could learn more information, especially very quickly, from other people, including the coach of the team. This was a very huge benefit, and I think it's something that's very difficult to get if I were doing the activity by myself. So in this case, I think by following this map, I was able to come to a pretty good reason. In fact, I think if I were going to write an essay using academic team as one of my examples, I think this would be one of my first reasons, that I can learn from other people. It helped provide this balance. So in this case, I think this is a pretty strong idea that came from thinking more about my own personal experience. Of course, connected to that, because other people eventually became friends. And this is something I didn't really think about at first. I didn't really know all of the people on the team the first time, but they eventually became my friends, and we eventually started sharing common interests. And so notice, this was something that I didn't think about at first. But the more I went through the process of mapping my experiences, this was something that came out later. And I think in a way, this could also be either another reason that we can make friends from this experience, or it could help support the idea about how we can learn from other people. Certainly one thing we can learn from others is how to be friends. So if you notice, look how many ideas we generated just using the one personal experience. Now we could continue to add more information to the map. We could spend a lot of time thinking about the academic team and then maybe jumping over to a different example. But I think the TOEFL really only needs about 2 or 3 good reasons. So in this way, I could use my academic team experience as my main example and then use that to help show different reasons that I'm trying to make. So one of the things I want to kind of emphasize here in this video is that it is important, try to use a personal experience or even personal experiences that have lots of possibilities to talk about. So I want you to think that, again, we've been using a lot of brainstorming tools throughout the video, but there are others as well. And I think concept mapping is definitely one way to help visually organize information. Let's look at a few others. One that's kind of similar to a concept map is called mind mapping. And in this case, mind mapping is much more general, kind of freely associating ideas. For example, the key to this mind map it was focusing on nature. And really the idea here is that any new idea that you could come up with relating directly to nature, you can draw a line or a branch. And of course, I want you to notice that the person also used an actual visual image from nature. In this case, they felt it was easier to connect to the idea by making kind of a free association. So again, notice many of the ideas that came from this. Nature helps think about, exercise, walking, but it also can help think about resting. It can help us be still, to help us look and listen to things. And we could really think about, in this case, that we want to honor being in nature, that it's actually kind of a separate environment or realm. So we can kind of be fully involved in this area when we go out into nature. So yeah, the idea here of a mind map, again, very similar to a concept map, is that we can continue to branch off ideas to really freely think about an idea. Maybe just thinking about words or associations that we might have with a particular concept. Another brainstorming idea is called just a Venn diagram. A Venn diagram is usually when you use kind of like overlapping circles. And the idea here is that there are some aspects of team sports and individual sports that are certainly different from each other. But of course, there are also similarities too, and that's perfectly logical to think that there are similar things that both might share. For example, both do promote healthy living, and both do encourage sort of excellence. Now, they don't necessarily encourage excellence in exactly the same way, but the key to thinking about, for example, team sports is that we want to be the best person we can in participating on the team. So in a way, it does help us kind of develop as a person, as an individual. But of course, individual sports, we definitely rely on ourselves a lot more. So it may be a different kind of excellence, but clearly both can promote a healthy lifestyle. So in this way, what you could do next is make a list of things of how team sports and individual sports might be different from each other. And this is a good way to get you to start thinking about the topic a little more deeply. Now, in talking more about the format, now we're starting to look at how we actually structure an essay. So we've been talking a lot about sort of preparing for the essay. Now we're starting to get a little more into the actual writing of the essay. Now, first off, what you see here is what we call a standard college essay format. Oftentimes it's referred to as a 3.5 essay. Now, it's called 3.5 because, first off, there are three main parts to the essay: the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. And then it's called 0.5 because there usually are 5 paragraphs. One paragraph for the introduction, one paragraph for the conclusion, and then usually 2 to 3 paragraphs for the body. Now, of course, there could be more, but this is just referring to a standard college essay format. Now, if you'll notice that in each part there are certain expectations. Now, in this video, we're going to focus a lot more on the introduction, and then in future videos, we're going to address the body and the conclusion. But in the introduction, we generally want to give the reader some kind of interesting thing to get them started in reading our essay. So you will learn in just a moment that is what we call the hook. And we want to kind of provide the reader with some particular context of what we're going to be looking at in the essay. And then finally, we're going to address what we call the thesis of the essay. So as you can see, the introduction has lots of very specific and technical things we need to address. The body usually includes different paragraphs looking at are the reasons that we're trying to make. Again, in a typical college essay, you might see 3 to 4 reasons, including supporting details and examples. And then finally, in a typical college essay, you have a conclusion, where you revisit the thesis, which again is located in the introduction, but you don't necessarily repeat it. Now, if you've had experience with this before, then I think all of this should be fairly common knowledge. But if this is new to you, well, then consider this to be a sort of an introduction to how we write, especially in an American university. Now, one thing you'll notice, though, is that the standard college essay format is going to be a little bit different from the TOEFL essay. But, of course, they share a lot of similarities, too. First off, I think that the introduction in a standard college essay is probably going to be a lot more developed than you'll be able to do in a TOEFL essay, mostly because of the time issue. You don't have a lot of time to write the essay, and really, in my opinion, the most important part of the essay is the body. So even if your introduction is very brief, clearly the body is going to be the part we need to focus on the most. Now, some differences. Again, I think the introduction and conclusions can be very brief. But the body, instead of thinking of 3 to 4 reasons, it probably is better to think maybe of only 2 to 3. So these are some just small differences, I think, that we see from the TOEFL essay format compared to the standard college essay format. So again, some things to keep in mind. Again, a college essay is usually very formal. Formal language, fairly standard organization and structure. But again, on the TOEFL, a little bit different. Obviously, this is more of a personal response. So even though that the tasks are somewhat similar in structure to a college essay, they are going to be probably less formal. For example, you can use, and in fact it's even encouraged if you used idiomatic expressions. But slang is not okay. Now again, slang is something very different from idiomatic expressions. So I think we need to understand that slang is not acceptable on the TOEFL. Spelling, grammar, and punctuation are important, but again, as we've mentioned before, they're not as strictly observed as maybe something you would see in a college classroom. Personal opinions and observations are desired, but we do need to use logic, so logic is still important. That is something that is pretty much common to both. However, personal opinions and observations may not always be required on a college essay. So in this case, this is what we would refer to as a personal essay. So as we said, writing the introduction is really the focus here for the remainder of the video. Now, why is the introduction important? Why do we actually need it? Well, one thing I think that we always forget about on the TOEFL is that we still need to make it interesting. Even though it's a requirement for the test, we still need to think about the idea of the hook. And again, the hook is how we get the interest of the reader. The introduction also helps provide some context for the reader. So again, obviously we know what the topic is going to be because the TOEFL gives us the topic. But we always need to be thinking about how we can provide a specific context so the reader understands what they're about to read. And of course it contains that all-important thesis. So in the TOEFL essay format, as I said, today we're going to be looking more at the introduction itself. So as we do that, notice first off, the introduction has kind of a general organization. The hook usually comes at the beginning. The thesis is generally going to be what we consider the last part of the introduction. And almost always it's going to be the last sentence. But that's not always the case if you're writing a college essay. Now, let's get a little more specific. What is a hook? Well, if you notice up here my picture of the fish trying to catch the worm, the hook is the item here that's trying to get the fish to bite. And this particular worm that we see on the end is what's trying to attract the fish. Well, in a way, I want you to think that the fish is like the reader. We want to get that reader to kind of follow along. We want to catch the reader's attention. Now, again, there are many different kinds of hooks, but obviously we don't have a lot of time on the test to think about the different hooks we want to use. So here are a few I think that work well on the TOEFL. One type of hook we call the hypothetical hook. Now, the hypothetical hook basically is asking the reader to imagine something, or to think about what would you do if you were in this case. Now, this one's kind of difficult, I think, at first to develop, but it really is kind of interesting. I like this one because it does kind of interest the reader, partly because we always want to see what your response would be. What would you do if you're in this situation? Now, taking our topic, again, the team sports, individual sports, look at the sample hook that I come up with here using the hypothetical hook. What would you do if you were able to play any sport you want? Would you choose tennis or football? Both are appealing and have their advantages. An individual sport such as tennis, and so on. So notice I use at the beginning, I provide the actual idea of the choice to the reader. Would you choose an individual sport or a team sport? And the truth is both have advantages. And then I might take a moment to say, what those advantages might be. But then at the end of the essay, at the end of the introduction, I'm probably going to state which one I prefer and then discuss why. Another type of hook, and I find this one to be very popular with students, is the personal experience hook. Actually thinking about our own life. And I think in a way this can help provide a framework for the entire essay itself. So notice in this case, again, going back to our example with team sports and individual sports, I used the hook of my own personal experience. When I was 16, I became the starting guard for my high school basketball team. It was a great experience, and one where I learned many valuable lessons for sports and for life. So notice in this hook, I'm preparing the reader for the idea that I'm probably going to say that I prefer team sports. So notice in this case, I use my own personal life to provide the context. That the team sport itself, my own experience, provided a great experience, and that it had many lessons that I'm probably going to share in this essay. Another very popular hook among students is the social view hook, and this one can be looked at from many different perspectives. So for example, oftentimes you may appeal to the idea of comparing the past and the present. So thinking about in today's world compared to the past. Or using an idea, kind of some of the same general language that you might find in the topic itself. People see bad news everywhere. So again, these are just some samples. Let's see how we apply it to our particular essay. The business world is becoming more and more competitive, but at the same time, it's also becoming more and more cooperative. In order to be successful, it's becoming extremely important to learn how to work on a team. So again, notice in this case, I connect the idea of sports to a different world, the business world. And I also prepare the reader for the fact that I'm probably going to choose team sports as my particular idea, as my particular argument. Because I mentioned that business itself, the real world, has competition, but it also has cooperation, which is what I'm going to prepare the reader for in my essay. Now, the key that I really stress with students is that I think you need to find a hook that works for you. Just as fishermen use different hooks for different occasions, or even for personal taste, I think you need to think, especially for the TOEFL, what's a hook writing style that you like and that you can develop. Of course, I think you need to practice writing different kinds of hooks and seeing which one suits your style. But really the idea here is, I don't think the hook should be terribly long, maybe 1 or 2 sentences. So again, some of the hooks might take a little long, may take a little too long on the test, but some might be very quick. It really depends on how you want to set it up. And of course, I do think it's good to look at other essays. How did other people, especially successful essays, how did other people structure them? Well, one of the nice things that ETS has done in the past is that it has provided some authentic responses to TOEFL independent tasks. Even though this is not included in the TOEFL Quick Prep download, they have provided information in the past using actual sample essays. So if you look below this video, I actually have a link to some sample responses provided by ETS to one particular kind of independent task. So again, my advice would be to look at the level 5 responses and see what you can learn from looking at that essay. So we've mentioned the hook. Now it's time to think about the thesis. Well, first off, the thesis itself is kind of the direct answer to the question in the topic. It's a statement that tells the reader what you're going to discuss in the rest of the essay. Now, for example, since I'm going to say that I prefer team sports, at the end of the introduction, I want to use a thesis that gives them sort of a direction as to what I'm going to be doing in the rest of the essay. So notice here's one sample thesis. This essay will explore why I prefer team sports to individual sports by giving some reasons for my opinion. Now you will notice right away that I state that I prefer team sports, but I don't necessarily explain why. I just state that I'm giving some reasons for my opinion. Well, again, that's because I don't want to give too much information in my thesis. The idea here is I want people to read the rest of my essay. But I at least provide the context by saying, okay, here was my hook. Now I'm trying to show that I prefer team sports, and then the rest of the essay, which of course again will be the body of the essay, will explain and include why I prefer these ideas. So again, think about how the thesis is preparing readers for the body of the essay. Okay, let's look at another one. I prefer to play team sports because it offers many advantages over individual sports. So again, I have directly answered the idea of which I prefer, but again, I don't specify exactly what those advantages are. I state only that there are advantages, and that I will probably, again, explain those in the body of the essay that's going to come next. Now remember, the thesis itself almost always goes at the end of the introduction. In fact, it's usually the last 1 to 2 sentences. It provides direction, and it kind of gives a hint as to the structure as to how the rest of the essay will go. Now, some people might include more specific information in their thesis, and that's perfectly fine. But I also want to stress that the thesis needs to be general enough that you don't give away too much information. So some professors, some writing teachers might tell you to keep the thesis statements fairly open. Others might state that you need to have a strong connection between the thesis and the rest of the essay. And we'll explore that, especially more in the next video. But I do want you to think that the body of the essay will always relate to the thesis. And that's how we need to help improve and strengthen the organization of our essay. But we'll talk more about this in the next video. So as we mentioned before, the thesis answers the central question of the topic. But each essay type, the defense, comparison, and explanatory, do have different requirements. So the thesis statement probably needs to reflect those requirements a little more closely. Writing an effective thesis really depends on your ability to indicate the requirements so that your readers know what to expect. Now, I find this is especially true for the comparison essay. But as we go through, we're going to play a little game here and see if we can try to identify what exactly are good thesis statements. So we're going to play a game called Good Thesis, Bad Thesis. So here are the rules of this activity. In this game, we're going to look at 3 different essay topics, one from each essay type. With each topic, we'll have 3 sample thesis statements to choose from. You need to decide if each thesis statement is a good thesis or a bad thesis. Then we will discuss why the good ones are good and the bad ones are bad. Now keep in mind there could be more than one answer for either one. So there are going to be 3 answer choices. So we have to recognize that there could be, 1 good thesis, 2 good theses statements, or even 3. So as we go through, be careful to recognize there could be more than one answer. So we ready? Let's play. Now the idea here is that as you read them, I'm going to ask you to pause the video so that you can spend a little more time reading through the choices. So I'll go ahead and read the topic. So here's number 1, our defense essay. Do you agree or disagree with the following statement? The most important aspect of a job is the money a person earns. Use specific reasons and examples to support your answer. Now here are your 3 choices. What I would like for you to do now is pause the video and then take a moment to read these 3 choices. When you're ready, come back and then you see which ones see if you agree, which ones do you think are good thesis statements and which ones are not. Okay, are you ready? Here we go. So looking at the first thesis statement, is this a good thesis or a bad thesis? Well, in this case, it's kind of a bad thesis, because if you notice, even though it says you agree, it states that money is important or something because it helps us buy food. Well, that doesn't necessarily answer the question in the statement. Even though you say you agree with the statement, it doesn't actually really connect as to why it's the most important aspect of a job. So in this case, it kind of indirectly answers it, but doesn't directly answer it enough. So in this case, we're going to consider A to be a bad one. Okay, what about B? Well, in this case, B is a good choice. It does give a direct answer and then gives us enough room to expand in the essay. So in other words, it's general enough to say that we're going to explain later, but it also gives a direct answer. Do we agree or not? And in this case, the person says, I do not believe that the amount of money is the most important aspect. All right, let's look at the last choice. What do you think? Well, in this case, it's probably a bad thesis. Now, why? Well, first off, it's probably a little too long. And it's also very, very specific. Even though it does directly answer the thesis, notice how it includes way too much information. It provides greater financial security, determines your value to a company and how important you are to that company. Plus, making more money is an incentive to work harder and produce better results. These are the kinds of things we need to indicate in our body of the essay, not in the thesis statement. So in this case, this one's too long and too detailed. So really, B is our best choice here. Okay, let's try the next one. This one is a comparison essay. Let's look at it. Some people prefer to plan activities for their free time very carefully. Others choose not to make any plans at all for their free time. Compare the benefits of planning free time activities with the benefits of not making plans. Which do you prefer? Planning or not planning for your leisure time? Use specific reasons and examples to explain your choice. Okay, so I'm going to list the 3 thesis statements below. And now again, I want you to pause the video, look at the 3 statements, and then see which ones you think are good and which ones you think are bad. Okay, are we ready? Here we go. Well, what do you think about A? Well, in this case, A does meet the requirements of a comparison essay. Remember, a comparison essay needs to state in the thesis the specific requirements of the essay. So in this case, I'll be comparing the benefits of both sides and then conclude with my preference, which is exactly what the essay is telling us to do. But also notice it does not state what my preference is. Again, that's not the purpose of the thesis necessarily. It's only to indicate what I'm going to be doing in the essay. So in this case, A is probably a good thesis. Okay, what about B? Okay, in this case, B is probably not a good thesis. First off, it's not appropriate for a comparison essay. It's far too specific. Remember, the essay asks us to compare. So in this case, we only need to give these particular details in the body. So in this case, this person has actually included a detail, not a thesis statement. It's much too specific. Okay, what about the last one? Good or bad? Well, in this case, it is a good thesis topic because it takes basically the same idea. It rewords it a little bit, but it does state that there are many benefits to both these ideas, which again is what the essay talked about. And then discussing these benefits will be the focus of the essay. So it does explain the purpose and understand the requirement. Now, of course, we do need to understand that concluding with our preference is a requirement of the essay topic. Does it necessarily need to be in the thesis? Maybe not. But clearly, if I had to make a choice between A and C, I might like A maybe just a little bit better. But the truth is, C does mention that there are benefits to both, and that discussing the benefits will be the focus. So again, C is probably acceptable. Let's try one more. This is an explanatory essay. If you could invent something new, what product would you develop? Use specific details to explain why this invention is needed. So, once again, I'll list 3 different thesis statements. I want you to pause the video, and then when you come back, see if you agree with which ones are good and which ones are bad. Are we ready? Let's check them out. So what do we think about A? Well, in this case, A is probably a bad choice. First off, we have to answer the question that there has to be some kind of invention we would develop. So in this case, in the thesis statement, we're saying that it's actually too difficult to come up with just one product. Well, that's not a good choice. It doesn't provide direction because what are you going to say in the rest of the essay? That you don't have an answer? Or that there are too many problems? The idea here is that we need to come up with an answer. So A is probably not going to work. What about B? Well, B is a good example. In fact, it's very clear. Now, it states that I have an idea for the particular product. So, for example, I would develop a new line of clothing that is integrated with technology. So I state what my product would be, and then I state that the rest of the essay will explain why it's a valuable addition to our lives. So it's very clear, and it helps provide good direction for the rest of the essay. Okay, what about the last one? Well, the last one is acceptable, especially if we state somewhere before it as to what your invention is going to be. So in this case, I would provide reasons and explanations as to why I believe my invention would be a useful tool. It's pretty much the minimum of a required thesis. And again, hopefully we mentioned what that invention would be in a previous sentence. So in this case, I think if you don't mention what the invention would be, that could be a problem. Now, looking at the choices between B and C, which one do we think is probably a better thesis statement? Again, I would probably say that B is the better thesis statement. It does indicate in the thesis what the product is, and that in the rest of the essay you're going to talk about how it would be a valuable addition. But C would be, I think, minimally accepted, acceptable, especially if we mention what the invention was in a previous sentence. So again, some final thoughts about the thesis itself. Remember that the better thesis statements are ones that do provide an answer to the central question in the topic without giving away too much information. We want to keep it somewhat general. Think of the thesis really as a roadmap. It kind of provides a general direction for how the essay is going to go. And it also helps demonstrate that the writer itself understands what the requirements of the topic are. Again, for those comparison essays, we definitely need to be a little more specific. So again, in thinking about thesis patterns, here are some recommended patterns that I think would be helpful. In a defense essay, we probably want to think about focusing on the reasons for why you would disagree or agree will be explored. Or you could state that you will elaborate on why you agree or disagree or prefer, and you will give reasons and explanations. So again, notice that you're giving your answer without being too specific. And finally, you might want to think about there are several reasons for why you believe this, and that this will be the focus of your essay. All of these are kind of recommended patterns that I would say that would be very helpful when writing a defense essay. Okay, now let's think about a comparison essay. Now remember, a comparison essay is a little more specific. In the thesis, we probably need to indicate that we understand that we're going to compare or discuss the benefits or advantages or even disadvantages, if this is what the essay is looking for, and then most likely we might want to state that we're going to conclude with our preference. Now, I think the last part is probably optional, but I think it does help clearly indicate where you're going in the essay. So again, I would recommend that this would be a good thesis pattern to use if you need to write a comparison essay. Finally, in the explanatory essay, we can state something fairly direct. We will explain why I would do something, or I will provide reasons and explanations as to why I believe this. So again, with explanatory essays, a lot depends on what the essay is actually looking for. That you're going to explain or give your opinion or explain or give reasons for why you believe something. Now in the next video, we're going to learn how we can connect the introduction and the thesis to the rest of the essay. So hopefully from this video, you're beginning to see how the introduction is actually constructed. And we'll be reviewing a lot of that information in the next video while beginning to talk about how to write an effective body for our video. Once again, we have lots of good recommended materials out there. We've mentioned these in several videos before, but I really think it's always helpful to understand that ETS has provided lots of good information for us from both of their websites. Also thinking about the test preparation textbook that they have, very good book, and of course our TOEFL TOEIC preparation website, the link you can find at the bottom of the page. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time for part 3, Writing the Body.